Hello, this episode of A Slice of Medieval was recorded on the 7th of September 2024 at the Historical Novel Society Conference at Dartington Hall in Devon. It features an illustrious panel of best-selling authors: Elizabeth Chadwick, David Gilman and Matthew Harvey.
Hello!
Well done, Matthew.
There you go.
He only did that to get you quiet. Well, we've always wanted to follow Bernard Cornwell. As Matt said to me a few minutes ago, in the early 70s, Mott the Hoople were a touring band, and they're the ones who supported them, the other band, the smaller and less important one, were Queen. We don't feel very Queenish at the moment. Okay, I'll just check I've got the right notes. I don't want to give you the father of the bride speech for next week. Okay, so who am I? I'm Derek Burks, and I write historical fiction. I've also stumbled into non-fiction, and for a bit of a change, I've just published a crime thriller. So that's what I do, and I also do a podcast, which some of you may have heard of possibly, called A Slice of Medieval. And my partner in crime on A Slice of Medieval, which is a kind of fusion of history and historical fiction, is my co-host here, Sharon Bennett-Connolly. And Sharon is someone who is a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, so that sounds really important. She's written a number of non-fiction history books, largely concentrating on the roles of women, and she gives regular talks on aspects of women's history. She also, another notable point, was an expert in the Australian TV series Who Do You Think You Are? So, high fame, really. So what are we doing here? Well, what we're doing is Writing Medieval is about talking to our illustrious panel about how they, through their words, paint a picture of the medieval period. So the sights, the sounds, God help us, the smells of the medieval period, but also things like the less tangible things like values, attitudes, and so on, because you can get the sounds and the smells and the sights right, but the medieval world is a very different one from ours. So it's important to get across somehow to a modern reader how medieval people thought, what their values were, what was important to them and what wasn't important. Anyway, enough of me. I'll shut up and hand you over to Sharon, who will introduce the panel.
Thank you, Derek. Yes, it's my pleasure today to introduce three of the greats, which is quite impressive after having Bernard Cornwell on before of medieval historical fiction writing. First up, we have Matthew Harvey. Matthew is the author of the critically acclaimed Bernicia Chronicles and A Time for Sword series. Beerbrand is one of my favourite heroes. And he also presents the popular podcast, he told me that, Rock, Paper, Swords, with fellow author Stephen A. Mackay, who you will see somewhere around with a microphone. If they want to talk to you, talk to them. They don't bite, they promised me.
They do?
Well, they do you. But that's a running thing between you and Matthew that we don't talk about.
Not here.
Matthew's latest book is Dark Frontier, but we're not going to talk about that because it's a Western. So, welcome, Matthew.
Thank you.
Next up, we have Elizabeth Chadwick, a best-selling New York Times author. Elizabeth's book, The Greatest Night, probably introduced most of us to William Marshall and gave him a host of fans he will never know he had. Elizabeth's latest book, The Royal Rebel, hit the shops 2 days ago. So congratulations on your new release, Elizabeth. And tells the story of the early life of Joan, the Fair Maid of Kent. And I can't wait to get stuck into that. So welcome, Elizabeth. And finally, but not least, we have the magnificent David Gilman, who has countless radio, television and film credits and was the principal writer on A Touch of Frost, which means I'm going to have to go back and watch all of them again, and was nominated for a BAFTA. David writes in many eras, but his Master of War series, set in the 100 Years' War, and now up to 8 books, is a masterclass in writing medieval warfare. And if you get to the end of To Kill a King, remember to breathe, because those last 2 pages, I've already told David this, I think they're the best ending to any book I've ever read. So welcome, David. So question 1. How do you present the medieval environment? Matthew?
Oh, me first. Right,
Yep.
okay, great. Well, we talked about sights and the smells and all of that. I think one of the things that is useful is obviously visiting places like this, which is great, so you could get a real feel of places like this. But I think one of the other things is with day-to-day life, you can take things that happen to you on a day-to-day and extrapolate them into the past as well, especially things I've used, for example, camping. You know, you go camping. I write about the early medieval period. And so in fact, I started taking really seriously the idea of finishing my first novel when I was camping, sitting by a tent at night in front of a fire. And everyone else had gone to bed, and I was left just checking the fire because my kids were little, and they said, "Don't leave the fire burning, Dad. You might burn the tents down." So I'll sit there. And I sat there, and it's very quiet, and you know the clouds were rolling overhead. It rained earlier. And I thought, nothing has changed really in 1,400 years since. And I was halfway through writing my first book, The Serpent's Sword, and it's set in 633. And I thought, nothing really has changed. This is exactly the same as it would have been then. And so you can take moments like that and think, we are just people living in our environment. Obviously, people in the past were much, much closer to the seasons, and the everyday life was, the climate, the weather was really important. So I think things like that are really important. And another thing, with my day job in the past, I used to have to travel quite a lot, and I went to places like India, which is very different, real culture shock for a Westerner to go to India, and you're surrounded by huge amounts of poverty. And talking about the smells, I remember the smell of a service station toilet on a motorway near Mumbai was something else. In fact, it's the worst smell I've ever smelled in my life. And I thought, I'm sure that an early medieval midden pit would have smelt like this. There would have been a place where people would have gone at the edge of the town, or where the tanners maybe were working. And so you can take those things and you can think, you know, how can I look at the world around me now, what life is like where I'm living in this moment, and extrapolate that far into the past, because that's what the people were living like. And you know, you can think people in Europe were living very similar to certain people in the world now. But I'm not going to keep talking because I know we haven't got much time, so I'm going to...
David?
What's that?
What was the question? How do you present the medieval environment?
I think Matthew said it all, really. It really does, for me. I've been cold, wet, tired, and very frightened in my life, and I think that does come into the text when I'm writing it. Not that consciously, perhaps. But if you, as again, look at this place, you've only got to look around you. If you go to France, if you go to any of the old towns in England, there is the history. And you can walk down the back alleys, you can do those things that everybody does as a tourist, but as a writer, you're looking for something else. And really, there's not much more to it. I want to start a story in the beginning, but I don't know what the beginning is. So where do I start? There's an incident, there's a place, and I draw upon my own experience and I draw upon my own surroundings. I've been lucky. I've lived here in Totnes for the last 25 years. and I've only just discovered some of the history for the latest book that I'm writing, and that's been quite incredible. So look at your own environment, and if you live out of the country, you can just look anywhere in the world and dig it out. And it's a matter of really digging until something strikes you as an interest. When I started writing these books, I had absolutely no idea where I was going or why I was even starting. What did start it? I think I had just finished a series of young adult novels. My wife came home from an art class, and she had done a fresco of this very handsome man on a horse in medieval Italy. And I didn't pay much attention at the time. And then it occurred to me that I had actually seen this in real life. And it was a fresco of Giovanni Acuto from the Duomo in Florence. And if you ever go there, it is a massive thing. And who was Giovanni Acuto? He was John Hawkwood, and John Hawkwood was an English mercenary. Now, an English mercenary in Italy in the 14th century, how did that come about? And there's the start of the journey. I didn't want to write about Hawkwood, but I did want to find about how do I get an Englishman into Italy? Well, that was very ambitious, because when I wrote my first book, my idea was to employ that fear I was talking about, to take a 16-year-old longbow archer into war and to have his fear put across the page. 16-year-old boy goes to war. I thought, I've got this sorted. I had no idea what I was letting myself in for. And that's the start of a writer's journey. So just produce what you want to produce in the way of writing the words you want to write from what you see and feel around you. Sorry, I've gone a bit off piece there, but there we are.
It's okay, David. We will let you. So, Elizabeth, how do you present the medieval environment?
I fell in love with the medieval period because I fell in love with a guy on a TV programme when I was 15. And so it was pure hormones when I set out. But I decided I wanted to write a book which was loosely fan fiction, but then took on a life of its own. And I wanted it to feel as real as possible. It's like when, even as a child, if you play dress up and if you have the extra hat or the gun belt or something, if you're being a cowboy, it adds to that feeling that you are, it's a prop. And so I began researching. The more I researched, the more interested I became. And it's getting at that reality. It was a case for me of acquiring knowledge in every arena. I think as writers of historical fiction, we have to be jacks of all trades. We might have certain specialist areas, but we need to know an awful lot to create our worlds. And a lot of that is actually sensory, I think. What were the sights, sounds, smells? And this is, I used to be a reenactor till I didn't have time to do so, but dressing in the kit of the time, actually using a replica cooking pot on the fire and finding out how this cooking pot actually worked in a peasant hearth, like a medieval cooking pot, early Norman I got. I found that you could stick it on the edge of the fire and it put a stew in it and it wouldn't burn on the bottom. It would plip away quietly as long as it was on the edge of the fire all day, so you could leave it. And the shape of the top of the urn meant that you could pick it up with, just a small piece of cloth or not even oven gloves as such. And also it didn't evaporate fast. So that was all sort of reenactment discovery. And I don't think I actually used this yet in a novel, but I could if I wanted. So it's getting that depth, I think. And as well as being sensorial, I have to think, what would my medieval character think with that particular sense? So like the smells of a midden heat, I think they're totally disgusting, but if it's your everyday thing, then you wouldn't perhaps be quite as affected. I don't know. So then I go back as deep as I can into primary source to find out what people how people were reacting to the senses, or reading books out of the library. And the senses in later medieval England by C.M. Woolgar is brilliant for that. And it does cover early medieval as well. Fantastic book, which has, you know, their reactions to different colours, their reactions to smells, what they thought of smell. You know, Henry III moaned about his latrines being stinky and he had to have them rebuilt. So it's things like that. It's I do tend to be a bit of a rabbit hole deep diver, I must admit, and I find it very fascinating. But I think was it C.S. Lewis very basically says that there's the magic and there's the deep magic, and I like to sort of dive into the deep magic.
Yeah, I mean, we've discussed a little bit the medieval world and how you try to present that. But what about the character? How do you make your characters authentically medieval? That's a bit of a leviathan of a question, I know. David?
Well, first of all, when I write, I'm basically writing the pictures that I see in my head. So I actually see all this in front of me. And when I see this character, I can describe him very clearly because it's as if he's sitting in the room with me. And when you bring the other characters in, they take on their own form, their own shape, and their own life. Now, you can read as much as you want to about the medieval period and how they behaved, and you can pick up on that. And you can go through the process of the chivalric code and how people behaved and what they did in battle. But when that character has to be put into a situation, I think there's a lot of oneself as the writer going through all those characters and how they respond both to each other, because I tend to have a sort of band of brothers theme, and how they interact. So there's the banter, there's this, there's that. And once you describe him physically, as Bernard said before, you have a very clear picture in your mind. But I don't over-describe a character of any of my books, because I found that my readers all have a very clear image of who this character is. I have readers sending me drawings of Master of War, my character Thomas Blackstone. I have described him, he's just over 6 foot, he's got dark hair, dark brown. But when I get these images coming back after book 4, 5, 6 or 7, they are nothing like this character, but it's in your mind. It's like listening to the radio. You listen to a radio play. There's your imagination. If we don't have you on board with your imagination, we're fairly lost. So that's my presentation is really quite minimal when it comes to describing characters. What does come out, I think, is through the dialogue, how they behave with each other, what they do with each other, and the bad language that's occasionally used. So I play with it as much as I can, but I minimalize it, if that makes any sense at all.
Matthew?
I'm going to be a bit contentious and say, talking about creating characters that are really medieval, I think is probably impossible. We don't live in the medieval period, and the further back you go, the more different the world was. And so I think you can get hung up on trying to be 100% accurate in everything that you describe. But I've always said, for me, it's authenticity is more important than accuracy. So you're trying to aim for some sort of authentic feel, that things actually feel believable, even if they weren't like that. You know, you feel that it could have been. And in the case of my books, you're talking early medieval period, you know, Dark Ages, what people would often refer to as the Dark Ages. And the world was a completely different place. My main character, Bearbrand, is driven by things like revenge and honour killing and feuds with other people, which nowadays in modern Western society are totally frowned upon. So, you know, you can see straight away that there's a big difference in the way that he thinks, but whether I'm capturing exactly the way that a person like that would have thought is really open to interpretation. I don't think he probably was, or people were exactly the way I'm portraying him. But it feels authentic, and as long as the world feels authentic and it is sort of true to what we do know about the time, or at least what we think we know about the time at this at any given moment, because everything's changing and our knowledge of the past changes frequently as well. But, you know, that's what I'm aiming for. And one of the other things that I think is very important is to understand that religion and spirituality was incredibly important. In the same way that in my books there's lots of violence and I said like feuds and honour killings and vengeance and everything. That's important for this warrior society that I write about. But throughout history, right up until very, very recently, really, and it's still the case in many parts of the world, religion is a real driving force in everybody's day-to-day. And there's really, you can't exaggerate the amount that religion coloured people's day-to-day life, and whether that's paganism before, you know, Christianity has swept through Britain in this case, or afterwards, of course, Christianity and the daily services and the bells ringing and the different times of going to Mass and the different saints' days and all these things. Everybody was steeped in religion, and I think that, you know, not maybe we can go on to more detail about religion, I think maybe in another question, but I think that's something very important to...
I was just about to strike off.
No, I think that's very important. It's very important to know that religion is an incredibly important part of people's lives, and I think it's very difficult for us as, you know, modern 21st century Westerners to understand what that was like. And so you've got to try to imagine what that's like, and again, sort of calling on your own experiences, and maybe if you've been to different countries and seen different ways that people respond, or read about the way people respond to religion, you can sort of think, okay, maybe certain areas of fanaticism, or what we might think of fanaticism now, maybe things were more like that in Britain, maybe in the past. You know.
Elizabeth, have you got anything to add?
Well, it's quite controversial, and people can come and ask me separately later on if they want. I'm here for the whole weekend. But I use the psychic to get at my characters by a very talented friend, and then I blend what comes through. She sees the past like a film, and it's pretty, as far as I'm concerned, authentic. But then I will go back and look at the ordinary reference books, academic tomes, and blend the two to get at my medieval period. But say, you can come and ask me about that off-piste, as it were. But other points to consider, it's down to research reading for me. It's not how I feel or react to an event ever, but how they would have thought and reacted. So as Matt says, bringing in the religion. There are many, many differences between our society and theirs. And there are also many similarities. A writer is a bridge between them now and then, and you're trying to get as many readers as possible across your bridge into that past. One of the similarities I quite enjoyed picking up was in a reference book I read, where a chronicler was talking about children, and complaining about children. And I think we can all relate to this. He said, children, he said, when they are babies, they keep you up all night with their screaming. When they are sort of junior school age, you know, they will go running out in the street and run under carts if you're not careful, or fall down wells. And when they are adolescents, they'll demand money and go to the pub. Or you have to keep dragging them out of the pub. And I thought, yeah, that's a complete link with today. So while I know there are many, many differences, we all also linked by quite a bit of common ground, and those have to go into the building of one's bridge.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have to remember that they are part of the human condition. They're not aliens, so that they do share a lot with us.
Yeah, it's like I say about when I'm talking about women in history. I can't imagine me being walked all over by whoever I'm married to in the 13th century, as I'm not walked all over by my husband in the 21st century. People deep down are still people. Yeah. And speaking of women, this is my question, seeing as I'm a historian, women's history. What are the challenges? Because women's lives in medieval times were very different to now. What are the challenges in portraying women in medieval times? And seeing as you've just written about a book about one of the most controversial women of the 14th century, I'm going to you, Elizabeth.
Oh, right. Well, what did I write in my notes? Well, there are very different expectations and social conventions. Women are a little bit more buried in history as well, I think, so you've got to dig deeper to get at them. So more deeply into the background. But it's a lot more nuanced than one side or the other, because I've seen different arguments around the internet for quite a long time, whereas you get the brigade who say that women were downtrodden and it was all really terrible, and other ones who have women, they were all free and it's not like it seems. And neither are true. There are nuances on both sides. It's neither one nor the other. Like the role of the widow was probably the most powerful, but even widows might have to pay money to somebody to stay a widow.
Yes.
Or if they were a widow with children, their children might be put into wardship for somebody's lucrative contract. So there were all sorts of permutations. What I've written here is the truth is variable and in between, but you probably do have to do a lot of digging.
Yeah.
And anyone who defies the conventions of the time will have a hard row to hoe. But there was an awful lot of soft power in matriarchal roles, I think.
I think one of my favourites is Isabella of Gloucester, after
Yes.
Geoffrey de Mandeville dies in 1215, and she says she signs something in my happy widowhood.
Yes. Yes, it wasn't that women were utterly powerless, but they had different forms of power, and they had to be cunning. Certainly not downtrodden, but also certainly not running about. There were rules and conventions that they had generally had to remain within. So I think that's all I have to say.
Thank you. David?
Well, there are so many interesting women in history, certainly in the period that I write about. And they can appear out of the research. I generally write about imaginary women that I create based on certain people. But once in a while you touch on real people. I mean, for argument's sake, strong women, Isabella of France, who was Edward III's mother, my word, she became known as the she-wolf. But these women were so powerful and so dominant. In fact, I went back to one of my earlier books in the 1340s when Brittany was being fought over by the French and the English won, of course. But Charles de Bois, he was captured, and his wife, and sent to England, and his wife, she was a 26-year-old Duchess of Brittany. She controlled 20, 30, 40 barons, different ecclesiastic places. She had towns, she had cities, and she gathered these forces and held the ground. These women were really quite something, and they weren't all matriarchs. These were young women, and they had a hard life, they certainly did. If you were widowed, the odds were you didn't have any status at all. And you would hope that a nobleman would take you on, because then you've got a home for your children, you've got a place to live. If not, you could end up in a convent. As Elizabeth said, your children were taken away from you. You really can't believe how amazing some of these women were, and they are out there. I don't write particularly about medieval women, but I do like to have a strong female character in just about, I think, every one of my books. Not only to counterpoint the masculinity, but also to bring out the strength of those individuals. In my last Master of War book, the eighth, To Kill a King, I thought for once I knew what the ending might be. That was really a joy. I was going to end up in Italy. Yes, I was definitely going to go there. Halfway through the book, this woman arrived, and she just turned the book upside down. and the book went in a completely different way. And the one thing I would say as an author is follow your characters. If you think you get stuck, look at the characters, male, female, whatever it is. Look at them, because once you know them, they will take you on the journey. And I remember when Bernard said there's no writer's block. There's no such thing as writer's block, but you can get stuck. You can take a wrong turn. Look at your character. Where would that character really go? And that, I believe, will take you along your story, and particularly if it's a strong woman. I'm not trying to be a feminist here. I'm just saying, look at them and explore them and expose them. Because once you get under their skin, it's a whole different dynamic in the book.
Yeah, definitely.
Matthew, we've got a couple of minutes, so if you could add to that for a couple of minutes. Or nothing.
Okay, I'll add to that to a couple of minutes, that's fine. So I think there's a tendency to write that all women in the past were rule breakers, and especially when you go back to well, I know you've got all of, the women who sort of, they want to stand up for themselves and they want to be strong and do everything. And that obviously, most women, I'm sure, wanted to live independent lives and do what they wanted to do. But the world was very much constrained in different ways. So I think talking about the soft power is really important. And when I'm writing about the early medieval period, you can read about it in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles and stuff, about this soft power. I'm trying to remember the name of the king who sends, I can't remember, it's a king in East Anglia, sends King Edwin is in exile, and he basically he's going to give him Edwin to another king who wants to kill him, basically. And his wife says to him, like, you can't do that, that's what you're doing. And in the end, because she tells the husband, you can't do this, he then sends King Edwin with an army back up north. He ends up conquering Northumberland or Bernicia and then Deira, and becomes the king. So the soft power of the wife telling him, don't do that, it changes the whole course of history. And just one last thing. There's a queen in my books. In the seventh book, I thought I'll have a romantic. So the main character, Bearbrand, will have a bit of a romantic thing with the queen. The queen will become attracted to him, but then trying to be authentic and thinking, well, she's not just going to jump into bed with this guy, even if she finds him attractive. And so you have to fight with the reality of the situation. You think, well, this woman, she just jumps into bed with the first warrior that she fancies and gets pregnant. What's going to happen to her? The husband's maybe going to find out and kill her. I don't know what could happen. And also, going back to the religion thing, she's very religious. We know she's very religious. She's a real person, Arnflad, and she's a devout Catholic. And so she wrestles with that in the book. And so although she feels this attraction, she doesn't just act on her urges straight away. And I actually had a female reader write to me very angrily and said, I've read all your books until now, and I've read this book, and I'm never going to read a single another one of your books. Because Queen Arnflad, who you've set up as this very strong character from the beginning, when you meet her as a child in the first book, she doesn't just do what she wants. She obviously feels attracted to Bearbrand, the big hunky warrior, but she doesn't sort of jump into bed with him. What's going on? She should be strong and powerful and do what she wants. And I replied back and I said, well, you've got to think about the religious aspects and the fact of the world is a very different place. And she is a strong character, but she's fighting lots of different battles. Mm-hmm. And she can't just act on it. And she replied back, I said, no, this is terrible. I'm never going to read one of your books ever again. Okay, so you can't win. And I think on that note, but we need to remember we're writing in the 21st century about things that happened far, far in the past. And that is a real balancing act. You're trying to sort of tell a story that's historically authentic, but you're also trying to appeal to a modern audience, and that's a fine line to tread as well. Sometimes going completely authentic is difficult, if not even impossible, and turns people off. So that's something to think about as well. So I'll leave it there.
Well, we have prepared another 53 questions, but time has defeated us. We might have a minute or two if anyone would like to ask any of the panel a question. Alison?
Yeah, you mentioned
You've got a microphone coming. If you just want, wait. Go.
Okay, I've got quite a loud voice, so I don't mind. People are undoubtedly devout, especially about the afterlife, because their current lives were so miserable, basically. Do you think that the further you went up the power structure, up the status structure, religion was more a matter of power rather than devotion?
I think probably it was a mixture of both things. I think there were some people that went higher up, into power structures and were very devout and religious and believed in it all. And I think everybody to some extent believed in it, probably in the back of their mind, even though they didn't believe at all,
or
thought
perhaps it was fear.
But I think some people were very sincere and devout. But I do think, undoubtedly, some people within the structures used it for their own devices. I've got two. I cover Cuthbert, who's become Saint Cuthbert, and Saint Wilfrid. Neither of them are saints when the book are being written, but both of them are religious characters. One I think is very devout. I portray him as very devout. Cuthbert. Wilfrid, I think of him as quite a venal character who's really in it just for power. And I think, and in my books he's pretty horrible, and I don't think in real life he probably was as horrible as I'm making him, but it makes for a better story, the fact that he's willing to basically tread on anybody to do what he can see to get himself further up the chain of command, because he's not the oldest son, so he's gone into the clergy, but he thinks, well, if I can become a bishop or an archbishop, then that's fantastic. I can be rich and have all the fun.
I think that's pretty common in most civilizations.
It's sort of human nature, isn't it, really? And piety is the same. For some people in the Middle Ages, their beliefs were paramount, but others would probably be paying lip service to it to an extent. Yeah.
Elizabeth, do you have anything to add?
What
about the religion?
I did, but it's gone out of my head. I agree. Yeah, I think that there were people who were in it for that it was more of a power thing, or it went alongside. And sometimes you actually find someone. One of the kings of Jerusalem, Amalric, was actually questioning God and the afterlife. This is in William of Tyre, which is really interesting. And he had this real worry about faith, And there's this. It's really very fascinating because he's king of Jerusalem, the Latin kingdoms, and there he is worrying about whether God exists, which was. And a medieval professor friend of mine who does social history and seems to think that there was quite a variation in religious belief as well, and that one size didn't fit all.
David, do you have anything to add?
Just a quick one. Basically, there was a lot of politics involved. I mean, the English were very unhappy about the French popes.
Yes.
Because they made a lot of decisions on that side. So, that had consequences, historic consequences. So there was a lot of politics going on. And, of course, right down the line, the religion had to be given to the masses. And if you go to any of the old churches, and you see all the carvings above, from birth through to death, that was the story being given to those people who couldn't read, who couldn't understand things, and that was their story. So religion was really integrated into everything, absolutely everything. And no fighting man wanted to die if he wasn't shriven.
Yes.
So forgive me my sins, and then I'll go and do the killing. So it's throughout.
Shall we have one more question?
Thank you. I preface this as being a long-time reenactor. Would you recommend authors going to join a reenactment society and actually experiencing the clothing, the cooking as Elizabeth did, and for the gentlemen, the fighting in full armour?
Wow.
Yes.
Well,
it's a very short answer for me. I think yes, if you possibly can.
Yeah.
But I think also, as Elizabeth said, it takes a lot of time and effort and energy. So, but the next best thing, I guess, would be, even if you can't join the group, to go and visit one of the groups and let them put a chainmail on, you know, wear a suit of chainmail or a helmet and a sword and things. And they'll and as you, if you're a reenactor yourself, you'll know that they'll be more than happy to speak to any author that goes at great length and show you everything. And so they are a massively brilliant resource actually for any writer.
And you can get, if you go to reenactors markets, if you want to actually buy some of the artefacts, then you've got something tangible that then you can translate into the novel, like my cooking pot, you know. You can,
Yep.
I think we're going to have to call a halt there. Otherwise, I'll get a slap from Tracy. Well, something to look forward to. Thanks very much to our panel and to Sharon. We could go on talking, as you all appreciate, for a long time.
Oh, yes.
But there are things like coffee breaks and so on.
And Bernard's waiting to sign books.
Yeah, that's
true.
true.
And we do not want to keep Bernard Cornwell
We don't
waiting.
know. No. Thank you very much.
So we will be signing books in here, I think Tracy said, at the beginning of the lunch break.
Yeah.
So do join us.
So don't eat. Just come here and get books signed.
And please do give our podcast a listen, A Slice of Medieval. Thank you.
Thank you.